I think is where a lot of people's fear about technology comes from, is that you can't really trust what you're seeing, and people don't want to get to a point where they can't trust things. They want to be able to trust things.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, because why don't we trust these fictional faces and things?
Yeah.
Well, we have this concept that there is this object level reality that is very stable and exists, and all the value resides in that. So if you encounter a face that doesn't belong to anybody who actually lives in objective reality, then it's a fiction, and fictions don't have value. But since the 90s, we've been living at least part of our life online in this world of relationships and signals, etc. And actually, there is quite a lot of value to at least some of us that does reside in this non-physical reality.
Yeah.
And indeed, you can make an argument that if you can have a persistent, useful relationship with some entity online, does it matter whether that is flesh and blood or a dog or a computer, as long as it's meaningful? And again, standard philosophical arguments about it. But I do think this disquiet is also that there is something about this deliberate deception. If we imagine that AI-generated faces that could all be identified as very different from us, but then in many ways it's kind of reassuring. Yeah, it might be ugly, they might be beautiful, but we're not trying to achieve its verisimilitude. I think we're a bit worried that we are losing our grip about what is true and real. And partially that is, of course, again, a way of channeling other concerns. So then we get into the fake news debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is interesting, because we had fake news forever, of course. But just that these days they act in a different way.
Yeah, because they had a real problem in the 1800s, I think, where when the printing press had just come out, and all of a sudden it became very cheap and very easy to produce loads of articles, that it meant that since it was so easy, people could very easily make loads of newspapers, and people started just making up loads of stuff because they knew that it would sell loads of newspapers, and then it then became that you had to peer review things, or at least have it based on some amount of fact, because there were people just making up all sorts of stuff just for the just because they knew that it meant that they were able to shift newspapers back then. And I feel like a lot of people are scared that same thing's going to happen again now with deep fakes, but to be honest, I think it will be exactly the same as things that are fake online already, with Photoshop and all of that sort of stuff, that you look at it and you're like, okay, it's fake. Like, I know it's fake. It's only people of an older generation who haven't been brought up with the internet who might struggle with that sort of stuff. Like my grandma.
I think you're right
on Skype
about this. So I think getting fooled can probably happen to anybody, and if somebody sets out to fool you in particular, they have a good chance because they can focus. But in general, of course, most of the fake news is about getting large groups of people believe something. And I think the really interesting part is, of course, that the worry about fake news is kind of a worry about how our society works and how we want to set up our information flow. And then there is the more metaphysical one. Can we tell if anything is real? And that is partially what I think the adversarial networks are doing. What I think would be even more interesting is, of course, how do these systems actually perceive the world? Actually figuring out their internal representation, which is awfully hard work. But I think some of the tools people are doing to get explanations out of neural network might be useful to also try to figure out. So how would the art critic neural network describe this painting, and what are its representations? How does it recognize that something is surreal?
Yeah,
that might be actually really interesting, because it might be that there is a pattern to surrealism that we humans have not noticed. Just like when it comes to biases, we are right now aware that neural networks shouldn't be picking up on racism and sexism, etc. So we're working rather hard on fixing that. But it might be that we have biases that we don't recognize at all, that the networks are picking up on, and we might be able to find in our pursuit of other biases. And then we're going to face this problem that we get a statistical argument that we humans are biased against this group of people. But we don't recognize that as morally bad. It's just kind of a weird thing that this research now finds that this group that we don't care about are bad. Because we think they're bad, and we think it's okay to think they're bad. But actually, this was, of course, the same situation as before we started realizing that racism and sexism was a bad thing. So we might have these disquieting discoveries also that maybe we want to do something about it, but we don't feel right now like we need to do it. Yet, by historical example, maybe we should.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because like I was actually I went to a comedy gig last weekend where I got to see Eddie Izzard perform his latest stuff, and he was talking about how it's really interesting how in the last 500 years or so much development has happened in terms of rights and in terms of people getting to a place where...
Sorry. So, that's a very loud phone. Yeah, the last 500 years, yeah.
Yeah, that things have, like, all of a sudden, even within the last 10 years, that there's been so much development in terms of people being able to express themselves more without fear of the repercussions of that, and all of that. And I was talking to one of my housemates about it, and she said that it's crazy, like, you spend some time online and all of this new vocabulary comes out, like, all the time about people who are trans, people who are gay. Like, there's this huge plethora of language that you literally 5 years ago wouldn't have had half as much, and I find that's interesting, because if you got AI to look at our society and all of that, and they did, for example, find a group of people who are underrepresented or get largely ignored by the rest of the world, it would be interesting to see interesting to theorize, I guess, whether you would naturally come to that point of realization about excluding those people within the next 100 years or so, or like 20 years or 10 years or so, or whether the AIs just come to that conclusion faster and therefore you'll sort it out faster. It's interesting whether it will fast track our civilization. In that respect.
Maybe it's possible to extrapolate where we're going, but I don't think that's likely, because we seem to be trying out so many different weird possibilities. The search space is so big, and we're probably following some slightly random path, although in the large there are probably rather big forces and the changes. But I do think one might use AI for this. In fact, I'm starting to think that this would be a wonderful project. You try to take some big corpus of data where we know that there might be racism and sexism, and then you use methods people are developing today to detect racism and sexism and other biases, to remove them, and then you continue trying to see what other things like them are there in there. Yeah. That would be a hilarious paper or project. I don't know how feasible it is, but wow.
Yeah, it would be really interesting, and see how far it would strip back society, because I feel like there's a whole load of subconscious stuff that you learn growing up, which ends up turning into bigotry and stuff when you're older. And then actually, and trying to avoid becoming very bigoted, you peel back those layers and you realise that they're there, and you're like, okay, well, everybody's got subconscious biases about this, that and the other. And it's trying to peel those away, being able to acknowledge them and be like, okay, well, I'm going to try and avoid being a racist person by not doing this, and being aware of that, and not being a homophobic person by being aware of this, and like doing this and that and the other, and not being transphobic by doing this, that and the other. And I think it would be really interesting, because it is kind of like it's like an onion, removing layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. And I wonder how far an AI would be able to take that and what would be left as a result.
Yeah. So one intuition I have is that it might be a bit like principal component analysis in statistics. So you take data that's fairly complex, and then you try to find the principal factors that determine the variations. And typically you want and hope dearly to only get a handful, because then you can project most of the data nicely into these one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional spaces, and you get most of the structure. This works beautifully, for example, for politics. In most countries, you find that politics is two-dimensional or something like that. So the different parties and their MPs form different clusters.
Yeah.
But that method, of course, gives you an infinite, well, or at least a very large number of other ways of organizing weaker components. And most of the time we tend to say, yeah, it's only the big ones that matter. But it might be the same thing going on here for the various biases. So as you get to the smaller and smaller ones, eventually they turn into strange noise. Maybe there is a pattern there, maybe it's just random noise, and we can't even make out what they mean. But I have no clue about how many big biases there would be. Would it be that actually, yes, it's just sexism and homophobia and racism and a bit of lookism, and beyond the big 4 or 5, it's all right? I really doubt that.
No.
I think we have very complicated biases.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a curve, probably. Because they will get to a point where it's like there are these very small biases at the end where it's like fucking nothing. It's like there are some people out there who don't like noses that much, but at the same time it would be interesting to see whether actually that would be a big thing or a small thing, or where along that sliding scale where certain elements would be. And whether there would be some surprise ones as well. I suspect there are a few surprises, and I think it's likely that we're going to say, yeah, but that's not a bias, is it? Isn't it that they're just bad? Yeah.
That's a good sign that, oh yes, this is an unexamined bias.
Yeah, absolutely.